Up. God bless you. Thank you for being here.
Check tests. Yeah, no problem. We're going to get started. As David and I talked about last night, the whole thought of what we're doing is knowing the truth. You know, Jesus said in John 8:32 that we should know the truth, and the truth would make us free. And in Philippians 4:8, Paul said, whatever is true, think on these things. God is concerned with truth. And too often in culture, we hear things and we don't evaluate by what is true, and that's what we want to challenge us this weekend, is we want to be able to evaluate what is true. And ultimately, we know that truth is found in the Word of God, and so as Christians, the very first thing we ought to be doing is going back and say, what does the Bible say? And the reality is, as we start to investigate truth, well, we see that some things happening in culture, well, that's not the way it should be happening. Well, this is what we see even when we look at America. What's amazing, though, is when we look at our nation, if you go back to when we really formed as a nation, go back to what the Founding Fathers did, what the Founding Fathers established, it's amazing what they put together. And I say amazing because it really was unique what they put together. It was unusual for what was going on in the rest of the world. And most people today don't recognize how special it is that we get to live in America. We are so blessed to be Americans because America really is a different nation. And just to give you an example, do you know if you look at something like the United Nations, this last year at the United Nations, there were 195 member nations. And that number does change almost every single year. Last year, there was 192. The year before that, there was 191. This number changes based on who goes to war with who conquers who captured who. The number's always changing. But what's amazing is of the 195 member nations that were present this last year, America was one of the only nations present who did not average a revolution every 30 to 40 years. Now think about for a second. When we watch the news and we see what's going on in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Egypt and all the unrest, that's not that unusual for the rest of the world. In fact, that's pretty normal. As Americans, we enjoy such stability, we cannot imagine what's going on, but this is one of the unique things about America. We've enjoyed more stability than any other nation in the history of the world, and our entire system, our entire form of government, we've only had one form in our entire existence. Now, this is rather remarkable because France started the same time we did, but they've had 15 constitutions. You look at Haiti's had 23 since 1801, and Brazil and Ecuador. In fact, Russia's had 4 since 1918. Poland, if you're 95 years old in Poland today, you lived through 7 different forms of government. You look around the rest of the world, and nobody enjoys the stability that we enjoy as Americans. The stability that we enjoy is unprecedented. Nobody else enjoys that. Well, this is one of the unique things about America. We enjoy stability on a different level than anybody else in the world. And by the way, not only do we enjoy stability as Americans, we enjoy prosperity as Americans. We make up only 4% of the world's population, but we account for 25% of the world's wealth. Now, that's amazing to consider because you would think statistically on average, 4% of the people, maybe 4% of the wealth. We have a quarter of the world's wealth in America. In fact, according to the last Census Bureau, the government does a census every couple of years, every so often to see where people are. And one of the things they measured was the level of poverty in America. And this is from the U.S. government. Here's what they identified. The people that live below the poverty line. If you live in poverty in America, you are more likely to have a telephone, more likely to have a television, more likely to have an air conditioner, to have your own car, eat more red meat, and have more square footage of living space than if you lived in the middle class in Europe, and Europe is the second wealthiest place in the world. You're better off in poverty in America than it's no wonder that so many people are trying to get into America, because they're realizing, hey, if we can just make it in poverty in America, we've elevated our lifestyle. Do you know what poverty looks like in America? In Washington, D.C., they consider you in poverty if you make less than $38,000 a year. You're in poverty. In Baltimore, it's $39,000. Our standard of poverty is unbelievable, because for the rest of the world, do you know that half the world approximately lives on about $2 a day? A quarter of the world lives on about $1.25 a day. We enjoy such prosperity, such abundance, that our level, the government says, there's a certain place below which we will not let you fall in America. We're going to make sure you're fed and taken care of. All this stuff, that's amazing. See, we enjoy more prosperity as Americans than any other nation in the world. Well, not only do we have a lot of prosperity, not only do we have a lot of stability, it's interesting, we also have a lot of creativity in America. Again, only making 4% of the world's population. Every year we come up with more patents, more inventions, more symphonies, more whatever you want to name than the rest of the 96% of the world combined. We do a lot. Well, this is really unique. It's unusual. This isn't like most places of the world. This is what used to be known and defined as American exceptionalism. That America is really a special place. Because American exceptionalism, it wasn't a term of pride that we think we're better than every other nation. It was acknowledging that America is different than every other nation. That what we do is not like every other nation. Now today, if you say American exceptionalism, that's enough to get you shot down on about any college campus, because people today are saying, wait a second, how dare you say America is exceptional because America has problems? Well, let's just be honest. Can you name a nation that doesn't have problems? Well, we're defining exceptionalism the wrong way. And here's why we have a lot of problems with this notion of American exceptionalism, is because largely today, we don't know how to define that term anymore. So for this morning, I want to start off, and I just want to define this term for us. American exceptionalism really describes the unprecedented stability, freedom, and prosperity that is a result of the institutions and policies produced by a unique governing philosophy. Now notice there is a sequence in which these things happen. Because of our governing philosophy, because of the idea that we started America with, we produced certain institutions and policies. Those institutions and policies then are what created the stability, the freedom, and the prosperity that we enjoy. It all is a result. It was a building block system that happened. It's very much like if you think about something like, let's say, a fruit tree. If you look at a fruit tree, we enjoy the fruit of the tree. But ultimately, if you want to know why did we enjoy the fruit, you have to go back to the beginning, which was to the seed. Because the seed is ultimately what produced the fruit. So the seed, which we would think of, that was our philosophy of government. The seed is what produced the structure of the tree, that structure being the institutions and policies. And from that structure, that is where the fruit was produced. So the fruit in America, exceptionalism, we would say stability, freedom, prosperity, things that are really unprecedented for the rest of the world. That is the fruit we enjoy. But the reason we enjoy that fruit is because of the seed that was planted. Whatever you plant is what you are going to enjoy in the future. Well, we planted something that was very productive, that was very prosperous, that we enjoy freedom, we enjoy stability. That seed is what led to that. So if we look at this, the question that would be very logical for us to follow up was, what was that philosophy then? What was the seed that was planted that led us to be a very special nation, that made us different than every other nation in the history of the world? Well, really, you go back to the National Birth Certificate. It's our Declaration of Independence. In 126 words, the Founding Fathers laid out 5 immutable principles. 5 principles that we understood this is the way things work. And on those 5 principles, this is what we established our nation. And if you go to the Declaration, we're just going to spend a little time this morning in this history lesson. The very first thing that we see, one of the first immutable principles, is this: that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator. One of the very first things that we identified in the Declaration, number 1, is there is a God. Now, this is very important to identify, because if there is a God, there are a lot of things that flow because there is a God. If there's not a God, then correspondingly, really, there's a lot of things you have freedom to do whatever you want to do because there's not. But if there is a God, then there are certain things that flow from that. Well, this was something we understood in America. Well, there is a God. In fact, when we look at the Declaration, sometimes we forget what the Declaration says. But if you look at the very top of the Declaration, it explains this wasn't just the notion of 56 guys that got together and signed a piece of paper. What the Declaration says is this is a unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. All 13 states agreed on this piece of paper. They all agreed. We acknowledge there is a God. In fact, George Washington, who is the father of our nation, who was the military leader throughout the Revolution, who led us in the fight against Great Britain, he becomes the first president of the United States. Really, absolutely amazing guy, incredible guy. But as president, he had the very first ever presidential proclamation. This was a Thanksgiving proclamation. So the very first time we go to thank God as a nation, because before this we've just been individual colonies or states or almost nations as it were, we become a united nation. We are the United States of America. This is the very first time that our nation was called to give thanks to God on the whole. Well, this was President George Washington, and I just want to show you why he said we needed to do that. This is what he explained in this proclamation. He said, it is the duty, and let me just pause there on the word duty, because this is a word that was very common in the founding era that is very much lost in our culture. In fact, if you look up the word duty in a dictionary today, most definitions will tell you it is something that ought to be done. Well, that's not a very strong word then, something that you should do. If you look it up, actually, at the time of the founding, even in Webster's 1828 dictionary, it's explained that duty was a legally binding contractual obligation. So something that you were legally bound, this is something you have to do. It was a contract. This is something, it's not an option. It's not something you ought to do. No, this is something Washington says it is the duty. So you have a morally, legally binding contractual obligation. And notice who he says has a duty. He says it's the duty of nations. Now, this is going to be significant because he's going to go on and explain that we have a duty as nations, and he's going to list several things we need to do. But he didn't say Christians have a duty. He didn't say the church has a duty. He says it's the duty of nations. And then notice the four things he said. It's the duty of nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. He says as a nation, we have a duty before God. And we have a responsibility because there is a God. Therefore, we have some obligations before God of what we need to do. Well, this was what he said nations have a responsibility. Again, this isn't just Christians. Nations have a responsibility. This goes back to the notion that we understood in the Declaration that there is a God. And we unanimously acknowledge there is a God. Well, because there's a God, here's the second thing they outlined in the Declaration. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Because there is a God, we recognize there is a God, and this God has given man rights. This is what we laid out in the Declaration. God has given us inalienable rights. Well, inalienable rights is another phrase that's generally lost in our culture. What does an inalienable right mean? Well, that's a good question. The founding fathers actually explained what this meant so we didn't have to be confused. You have people like John Adams. John Adams, the second president of the United States, the signer of the Declaration. John Adams explained it this way. He said, inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly government and cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws. They are rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. So what's an inalienable right? It's a right which God gave to you. And by the way, John Adams says this happened before government ever existed. That inalienable rights are antecedent. So it came before government existed. And I pointed this out last night, but just to refresh our memory, remember, when did God establish government? It wasn't until Genesis chapter 8 when Noah landed on Mount Ararat. And God establishes the Noahic covenant, the Noahide laws. And this is where God gives the very first civil ordinances. But when did God give rights to man? Well, that was Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. See, government was not formed before God gave rights. Government didn't give rights. God gave rights. And after God gave rights, then God established and formed government. This is what John Adams explained. Well, then you have people like John Dickinson. John Dickinson was a brigadier general for his state in Pennsylvania. He went on to become a governor of Delaware. Really incredible guy. But then he went on and he was a member of the Constitutional Convention. Went on to sign the Constitution. Well, this is one of the things he explained about inalienable rights. He said an inalienable right is a right which God gave to you and no inferior power has a right to take away. So that's something God gave to you and nobody less than God can take that right away from you. Hello, government. If God's given me a right, you're not bigger than God and you can't take it away from me. This is what we understood about inalienable rights. In fact, even people like Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, who is the aide de camp to Washington, who went on to sign the Constitution. One of the guys helped do the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton said, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the aid of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. Real plain, it's something God gave to you and nobody else can take away from you. See, we understood what inalienable rights were. It's a right which God has given to us. Well, then logically, if we understand an inalienable right is a right which God gave to us, a good follow-up question would be, well, then what are the rights that God gave to us? Because we understand there's a God and God has given us rights. So what are the rights that God gave to us? Well, Sam Adams explained it this way. Sam Adams says, first, a right to life, secondly, to liberty, and thirdly, to property. And this is, by and large, what they explained. Today, we know it as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the pursuit of happiness used to be known as property. That was part of the American dream. It used to be, we understood, the American dream was that you could own your own place. You could be your own boss. You could be a success. You could do, because in Europe at the time, the king owned everything. And so you could never own your own place because the king owned all the land and all you could do was work for the king and serve the king. And we said, no, in America, you're going to be able to be independent. You are the king of your own castle. You're in charge of your own thing. That was kind of the American dream because we understood with freedom and opportunity, there's nothing you can't do. That was the American dream. That is why people still come to America, because they want to have freedom and opportunity to be all that God created them to be. Well, this is what we understood was first there's life, secondly liberty, and thirdly property. And by the way, then we also had the Bill of Rights. The reason we have the Bill of Rights was to protect the other inalienable rights we knew that God had given us. The ability to speak, or religion, or assemble, or self-defense, or private property, all rights that God had given us. The Bill of Rights was written to show these are other rights that God gave us, and government, you can't touch the rights that God gave us. This is why we outlined that in the Bill of Rights. Well, this is what we understood, is that God has given rights to men. And then you go on in the Declaration, and you see the third thing from the Declaration, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Very simply, the Founding Fathers explained, the reason we have government is to protect the rights that God has given to us. That is the reason we're establishing government, because there's a God and God has given us rights. Government, your job is to protect what God has given to the people. And this is what we understood for a long time. James Wilson, who was a signer of the Declaration, also a signer of the Constitution. Only 6 guys signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He's one of them. He was also an original member of the U.S. Supreme Court, put there by George Washington. He also started the very first organized law training in America. He wrote some of the very first law books in America, and in his law books, when he used to teach his students, this is what he explained to his students about government. He said, the principal object of government is to acquire a new security for the enjoyment of rights which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise and all-beneficent Creator. The reason we have government is to make sure citizens are able to enjoy the rights God has given them. That's the reason we have government. This is a little different than what we think today. Sam Adams, he explained that government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. The reason we have government is to preserve the right that God gave us. That's the reason we have government. And then this is when he explained what those inalienable rights were, when he says first is a right to life, secondly to liberty, and thirdly to property. What's interesting about this list he gave us, he says the very first thing is a right to life. Now, today the phrase a right to life is a rally cry for many people, because right to life, if we're talking about the issue of a right to life, we're talking about the issue of abortion. We want to protect the unborn. That's what that word and notion kind of means to us today. But you always want to keep things in context. So we don't want to take Sam Adams out of context. So what would Sam Adams be talking about? Because he probably wasn't really dealing with abortion, because abortion wasn't probably something they dealt with back then. That's more of a modern and new thing. Now, I just gave you a fallacy, and let me point it out. One of the things that the Bible teaches, in fact, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, he says there's nothing new under the sun. Why do we think we deal with abortion now and they didn't deal with abortion back then? Why do we think it's a brand new thing? See, human nature doesn't change. You know, one of the amazing things that we have in our library, this is a book from 1808, Observations on Abortion. 1808. Now, wait a second. I thought Roe versus Wade in 1973, that's when abortion really was a big deal. No, as long as there were girls getting pregnant, there were girls who didn't want to be pregnant. Technology has certainly changed. Issues seem to stay the same. There's nothing new under the sun. See, when Sam Adams says the very first thing is a right to life, guess what he's talking about? The right to life. That's exactly what he's talking about. Because he understood, why is this the very first of the inalienable rights? Well, first of all, let's just be practical. If you're not alive, you can't enjoy any of the other rights. So the very first right has to be the right to life. Because if you're not alive, you don't get to enjoy everything else God has for you. But the very first thing he said is a right to life. James Wilson, this is what he explained to his law students again. James Wilson said, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. Now, the common law is what we operated in America. We still operate according to some of the common law today, but that was our system of law. He says, we protect life under the common law, and then he went on and explained. He said, in the contemplations of law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb. By the law, that life is protected. Now, let me just point this out. He says, as soon as that baby is able to stir, we protect that life in America. Now, that seems very impressive, but let's break it down for you. Why did he say as soon as the infant is able to stir? Because back then, that was the first time you knew you were pregnant. They didn't have the technology to know they were pregnant before that. And so, man, we're not sure what's going on. Oh, the baby's moving? You must be pregnant. What he explained is, as soon as you know you're pregnant, the law protects that life. In America, we protect the life of the unborn. That's amazing, because technology has now changed that you can know a whole lot sooner when a girl's pregnant. And James Wilson says in America, as soon as we know someone's pregnant, we protect that life. In fact, John Witherspoon was a signer of the Declaration. He was a pastor. He actually was the president of Princeton University for a while. And after the Revolution, he actually was over in Europe for a while. He was speaking and doing in Europe. And in Europe, he saw some practices that really very heathen-like practices where actually abortion was one of the issues they were dealing with. And John Witherspoon explained why America was different on that issue than, say, France or some of the other nations in Europe. And here's how he explained America was different. He said, a perfect right and a state of natural liberty is the right to life. He said, in America, we've denied the power of life and death to parents. How are we different than France? Well, see, in France, they let the parents decide whether or not they want to keep the baby. In America, we don't let the mom and dad decide whether or not they want to murder their baby. We've denied that, see, because we believe in the value of life, and we believe that God is the one that gave that life, and therefore that life is protected. God gave the right to life. See, America was different even all the way back then, and John Witherspoon explained, we protect life in America. Well, Sam Adams says the very first thing is a right to life. Now, the reason that matters is not just because that's where all your liberties are birthed, is when you are birthed, then all the things that God has planned and purposed, all that God created and formed and did, we recognize that. But here's a second notion. You know, based on the way someone views this issue of a right to life, it really tells you the way their perspective is in life. Because if you don't believe that life is a gift from God, if you don't believe that God is the creator, the sovereign, the author of life, then you're going to have a different view on a lot of other issues. You know, just based on the way someone views the issue of a right to life, do you know I can tell you the way someone's going to view something like whether or not we can acknowledge God in public, whether it be at high school football games or city council meetings, because if you don't believe that God is the author and the giver of life, then you probably don't believe that we should be able to pray to the God who did not give me life. Just based on the way you view the issue of life, I can tell you a lot of other things you believe. See, if you don't believe God's the author and giver of life, you also don't believe in my biblical right to defend myself and my family. Because if God's not the author and giver of life, well, then we have just devalued what life is. And so we've changed this. Well, you can't defend your family. You can't defend your wife and your kids. You can't do. See, just based on the way someone views a right to life, I can tell you a lot about them. I can tell you the way they view marriage. Because if they don't view life as something that came from God, they don't view marriage as something that came from God either. They don't view marriage as a covenant that God established in the Garden of Eden between one man and one woman together for life. Their view of marriage is going to be very different. I can tell you that just by the way they view a right to life, because that tells me the rest about what they think in their worldview. Even the issue like something of private property. Now, Why would private property be a big deal? Well, I don't know if you're familiar, but we have a government that's really kind of overreaching and a little out of control. Maybe you haven't heard of the Bureau of Land Management or the EPA, or we can keep going down the list. It's unbelievable. Well, if you don't believe God is the author and giver of life, then you don't believe in the 10 Commandments, which says don't steal and don't even covet what's somebody else's. See, I can tell you what you view in life based on the way you view a right to life. And what's amazing about this, as I'm saying that, I understand what I'm saying, that most of what we're dealing with social issues. And, especially if we start talking about politics, people get concerned, because I can tell you, if you're looking at a political leader, you can just look at the way they view a right to life, and you can know a lot about that political leader. And a lot of people go, wait a second. Political leaders, we're not as concerned with the social issues. Political leaders, we're more concerned with the economic issues, because that's where our nation, we need to have a strong economy. We need money. We need to do, what's interesting is there are groups that track what our nation does, whether it be all the financial problems we have. Because, by the way, we do have some economic problems in our nation. Anytime you spend more money than you make, you're going to have problems. We do have some problems in our nation that we need to solve this problem. But there's groups like the Americans for Tax Reform. And what they do is they actually will track congressmen. And so they'll go and they will give a list of the people that are the very best economic representatives. And all they do, the only thing they measure is how they vote on economic issues. That's all they measure. Now, there's all kinds of groups that will measure and track and follow data based on whatever your concern is, but the Americans for Tax Reform, all they do is follow economics. Well, here are the people they said were the very best economic representatives. Now, let me point out, whatever your issue is, there are people that will follow that issue. If you care about guns, the NRA ranks all their guys. If you care about the environment, whatever it is you care about, people track that issue. Well, remember Sam Adams says the very first of all our liberties is the right to life? Do you know there's groups that track the issue of life? In fact, the National Right to Life is an organization that will go and they will rank the congressmen who do the very best job on the issue of life. You know what's interesting? When you compare the people who are the very best on the issue of life and you compare the people that are the very best in economics, you know what's amazing? Is there's a one-to-one correlation. Now, maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe that really isn't fair. Well, so maybe if we look at somebody like the worst economic representatives, and then we compare it to the worst people on the issue of a right to life, no, it's still the same. How in the world? Let me give you the simple principle. It shouldn't be that complicated, but apparently it is. But let me help you understand. If they won't protect your life, they won't protect your money. Not real complicated, but see, you know what's interesting is Sam Adams, he said the very first issue you should be concerned with is the right to life. It doesn't matter if you're motivated by social issues or economic issues. The very first thing you should look at is the right to life. But here's the underlying principle we outlined in the Declaration. The reason we have government is to protect our God-given rights. And the very first God-given right was the right to life. That's what the founding fathers explained. Well, then you keep going to the Declaration. It says, and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them. Now, the laws of nature and nature's God was a very common and popular phrase back then. Today, we're not as familiar with it, but we used to understand what that meant. We understood the laws of nature and nature's God. We're talking about a standard of morality, that there is a fixed moral law that God has outlined, that things are right and things are wrong. Well, the laws of nature and nature's God, as I mentioned, a very common and popular phrase in the founding era, it actually came from William Blackstone. William Blackstone wrote Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. It was a very famous and popular law book. In fact, John Adams said that American lawyers studied Blackstone like Muslims studied the Quran. So they were spending a lot of time in this thing. Well, Americans knew what the laws of nature and nature's God, we knew where that came from. And what Blackstone explained when he talked about the laws of nature and nature's God, he says, everything you need to know about life, you can see from the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. And what he explained is that the laws of nature in and of themselves, you should be able to look at just creation. And from creation, there's a lot of things you ought to be able to see. Well, you notice what Paul said in Romans, that the intricacies of the Godhead can be seen in creation so that all men are without excuse. Creation can tell you a lot about who God is and what God expects and what God wants. Well, you start looking at creation, you know there's some interesting lessons you can see in creation. For instance, if we took the topic of self-defense, If you looked at nature, can you see that God maybe put something in nature related to self-defense? Absolutely. You know what? You just try to attack some mama's kids and you see what happens. Now, by the way, I was talking about animals, but that's people too, right? I've been a coach for 10 years, and I can tell you there's nothing scarier than when some mama gets angry at coach because her little baby didn't get to do something. That mama's coming after you, fangs and all. You in trouble. Here's the reality. It doesn't matter how many laws you pass. If you tell a lion you cannot defend your cubs, that lion will always defend her cubs because it's the law of nature. You cannot legislate or stop something that God put in nature. You can't do it because that's something that God created that is above what we could legislate. See, if you just looked at creation, you would know something that God is the one that gave us the ability to defend ourselves. And by the way, to the highest means possible is even what you see in nature. Using every advantage, every strategic thing that you have to defend yourself. That's what you see in nature. God put that in nature. Well, then you look at the issue of liberty. You know what's amazing is there's more than 10 million species in creation. Do you know there's not a single species that is born into slavery? God created everything free. Do you know William Blackstone pointed out that all men, what we said in the Declaration, that all men are created equal. We understood God created and there's freedom. Now, let me just explain. This is something that we don't hear very much of today, especially with the Founding Fathers, because one of the biggest things we hear about the Founding Fathers today, not just they were atheists, agnostics, and deists, but they were racists, they were bigots, and they were slaveholders. This is what we hear all the time about the Founding Fathers. So let me just address this issue because it's very common. We actually had a group of law students come this summer to Wall Builders. We have a large library, 100,000 original documents. And so we bring in groups all the time, and school groups will come every year, and they want to just come and take a tour. And so we walk them through, but we have these law students come in. And so we asked the question, have you guys heard the Founding Fathers were racists and bigots and slaveholders? And they all said, oh yeah, we've heard it. And I said, okay, great. I said, that's a picture of the signers of the Declaration. Can you tell me who in that picture owned slaves? And they said, well, you bet. Thomas Jefferson, he owned slaves. I said, he sure did. Who else owned slaves? George Washington didn't sign the Declaration, but yes, he did. Okay, now you've named two. Now, let's be honest. There were 56 signers of the Declaration. There were 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. There were 90 framers of the Bill of Rights, not to mention you had governors and other leaders. There's about 250 men that were founding fathers. We know two that owned slaves. Do we know anybody else that owned slaves? Hamilton? Why, if you look at 3 people out of 250, do we assume the rest of them are like that? Let me be honest. I don't know your church at all. But if I measured you by 3 people, you would sure hope I found the right 3 people. Because there's some people you're like, oh, no, don't talk to them. Get him away, come here. Hey, come here a second. Let me be honest with you. Now, by the way, let me point out, George Washington, I don't know anybody that considers George Washington, that knows George Washington, that considers him a racist. And that's because if you know George Washington, what you know is he did not treat his slaves the way that we think about slavery. By the way, Washington freed all his slaves upon his death, which, by the way, everybody that most people know that owned slaves, George Mason, another guy people sometimes know that owned slaves, they were all from Virginia. All the guys you name were from Virginia. You know, one of the things Thomas Jefferson wrote on several occasions was that the laws of Virginia prohibit us from freeing our slaves. Do you know when Washington died, the one exception was you could free your slaves on your death, and Virginia then changed that law to say you can no longer do that after Washington died and had freed all his slaves. But you know, Washington actually paid his slaves a salary. He also actually gave them their own fields that they could grow their own crops and cultivate. They could sell, they could trade. He kept all their families together. He did not treat them the way we think of slavery. It was much closer to indentured servants than what we think of as slavery. And by the way, do you know Frederick Douglass, the hero of the African American, the black community? Frederick Douglass said Thomas Jefferson was the hero of all blacks because Jefferson laid the foundation for the abolition of slavery. Well, if Frederick Douglass thought Thomas Jefferson was the hero of the blacks, Why is it today that we think Jefferson is the worst guy that's ever lived, ever, and he's the only... See, this is what's amazing. We know so little history, and the things we think we know, we really don't know as much as we think we know. If only 3 guys, or actually I named a 4th one that owned slaves, here's what's amazing. Do you know of the guys that signed the Declaration, there were more guys that started abolition societies than there were guys that owned slaves that signed the Declaration? There were more anti-slave. In fact, guys like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush. Do you know in 1774, they tried to form the very first abolition society in America? And at that time, we were still British colonists. And King George said, no, you can't abolish slavery because you're British colonists. And in British colonies, we have slaves. You can't abolish slavery. So Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush said that maybe we don't want to be British colonists anymore. The reason they joined to fight for independence was because they wanted to see slavery abolished. In fact, they formed the very first abolition society in America. This is the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin was the first president. Benjamin Rush then forms a national society, not just Pennsylvania, not just Philadelphia. It goes national to abolish slavery in every single state. Why have we never heard this before? Or, by the way, Benjamin Franklin then joined up with Francis Hopkinson, and they started a series of schools to educate the black Americans, the African Americans. And by the way, slavery was outlawed in the South all the way up to the Civil War with a punishment of death and hanging if you educated blacks. And the reason was, they explained, if the African Americans, the blacks could read, they might read the Bible. And if they read the Bible, they would learn about what God has for them. And then they wouldn't want to be enslaved anymore. And we'd have a lot harder time controlling them. The easiest way to control a people is to keep them ignorant. Hello? That's exactly what the argument... So it was illegal to educate African Americans at that time. These 2 guys said, we don't care. They started a series of schools just to educate the blacks and African Americans. Then you have people like Stephen Hopkinson, who was a governor of Rhode Island. He was one of the only guys who was governor before we separated and governor after we separated. Most governors before we separated from Great Britain were appointed by the king. Stephen Hopkinson was not. He was elected. Well, after we separated from Great Britain, he was still the governor. One of the things he tried to do as governor before we separated from Great Britain, before 1776, he was the very first governor in a state that tried to abolish slavery in his state. The king told him, no, you can't. Well, then we separated from Great Britain. 1776, they reconvened now as an independent state. Their legislature wrote and passed the very first abolition law in America. Rhode Island in 1776 was the very first state in America to outlaw and abolish slavery, and it was done by Stephen Hopkins, the governor, who was a signer of the Declaration. Well, why don't we hear about that in any of our history books? Why don't we, that 8 of the 13 states, when we signed the Declaration, 8 of the 13 abolished slavery before the Revolution ended. Why don't we hear about that? It was only the southern states who maintained it, and they maintained slavery because they said, we've got these big plantations and farms, and we can't maintain without these slaves, so we can't afford to abolish slavery. By the way, one of the provisions Thomas Jefferson put in the Declaration was one of the grievances, the reason we wanted to separate from the king was slavery. But the southern states said, no, we need slaves too much. Thomas Jefferson said, it's not worth fighting this battle right now. So they took that provision out of the 27 grievances just so they would have something they could agree on so they could separate from Great Britain. He said, that's a battle we can win later. Why in the world don't we know any of this history? And by the way, then you have John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton University. When he was president of Princeton University, do you know he allowed blacks and whites to be trained together the whole time when nobody else was doing that at the time? He said, I'm never turning a black away who wants to come and be educated, who wants to come to college. Nobody else was doing that. John Witherspoon did. Then you have people like William Ellery. He and Rufus King are the ones, when the Northwest Ordinance was passed, one of the things we said in America is you cannot be a new state in America if you have slavery. Well, William Ellery and Rufus King are the ones that wrote that provision in the Northwest Ordinance, signed of the Declaration, who said, we're not letting states come and join the Union who have slaves. This was another provision. James Wilson. James Wilson, we've mentioned before, signer of the Declaration, signer of the Constitution, did the first law schools, member of the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you know that actually when we did the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson, he made a provision that we should abolish slavery going forward because now that we're a nation, we need to get rid of slaves. And all the southern states said, no, we need our slaves. James Wilson said, well, then let's do a 20-year provision for the South to wean themselves off slavery so that we don't have slavery anymore because slavery is an abomination before God. We don't want slaves anymore. Well, that actually was a bill that was argued before the floor of Congress. James Wilson's the one that did that, signer of the Declaration. What's amazing when you start looking at these guys, we have no idea about all these guys who were heroes fighting against slavery. We only know about the one guy that owned slaves, and we think everybody else was just like him. We know so little history. See, this is where David and I, the point of what we're doing is truth be told. We want to know the truth. You don't need to believe something that's not true. And the reality is, we believe a lot of things we don't know very much about. Well, I read it on the internet. Well, I saw it on Facebook. Well, somebody told me one time. The problem is, you need to know what truth is, and sometimes it's not always truth, but you read on the internet what you see on Facebook and what your friend told you. Now, I will also point out, you shouldn't believe me either. But I will also point out, we do have the documentation, so don't believe me, but believe the original documents where we can show you what they said and what they did. The reality is, you need to investigate and discover truth. And when you start discovering truth, what you find is we often hear about the exception and not the general rule about who these guys were. In fact, if you even go back through history, let me give you a couple examples. Paul Revere, let me back up. Paul Revere, when he made his famous midnight ride, do you know Paul Revere wasn't the only guy that made a famous ride? In fact, when Paul Revere made his famous midnight ride, there were a couple dozen guys that rode that very night. Do you know one of the guys that rode to warn the Americans the British were coming? His name was Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was the very first African-American ever elected to office in America. He served in public office for nearly 50 years at a variety of positions. Now, wait a second. The argument that I hear from professors today is that, well, the white founding fathers would never let blacks serve in office, and they couldn't vote, and they couldn't do this. Excuse me? Well, we don't know about Wentworth Cheswell. In fact, let me just give you another example. Lexington Green, where the shot was heard around the world, when those guys assembled, the guys that were there on the field, at the end of the shot around the world, there were 70 guys who were there, but 18 guys lying dead and wounded. Of those 18 guys, you had people like John Robbins and Prince Esterbrook, who were black and white guy who were there fighting together. Why were they there together? Because they came from the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. Because when the British were coming, they rang the church bell, and all the men from the church assembled, and Jonas Clark says, we've got to go out, we've got to stand against the British. It was blacks and whites fighting together, and they went to church together. What your church does, where we say, hey, we don't care about what you look like, we're Christians. We care about loving Jesus and doing what God's called us to do. That's the way it should be. We're not looking at the color of skin. How about we measure the content of the character of people? This is the reality. We used to have this happening, and we never hear about it. See, all we hear about is the racial divide today. How about this? The Battle of Bunker Hill, this is the famous painting. Do you know who nobody knows about? It's this guy right here. This guy is Peter Salem. He's standing behind this guy who's Thomas Grosvenor. Do you know Peter Salem was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill? He received over a dozen commendations for his bravery on the battlefield. The Battle of Bunker Hill, by the way, was one of the major battles in America. We lost that battle, but we defeated the British on a large scale because we killed so many of their men. By the way, the only reason we lost the battle is because we ran out of ammunition. As we ran out of ammunition, Peter Salem, without ammunition, is staying there fighting, helping protect the other Americans as they escape and retreat. Peter Salem was the hero. Why have we never heard his name before? Why have we never heard? Or, by the way, you've seen this picture perhaps where Washington crosses the Delaware. Do you know who's in the ship with him? In the front of his ship, he has Prince Whipple and he has Oliver Cromwell, two black patriots who fought with Washington in the Revolution. We've never heard their names before. Or what about someone like Marquis de Lafayette, who's a French major general in the American Revolution? Do you know he had a good friend, James Armistead? James Armistead, who was a black patriot, who, by the way, because he was friends with Marquis, he and Marquis were talking, and Lafayette told him, he says, okay, James, the Americans are outnumbered. We don't have the supplies. We don't have the guns. We're going to have a really hard time beating the British. We're going to have to come up with a way that we can do better. And so, as Lafayette and James Armistead are talking, they say, you know, we really need to get some better intelligence on the British. So they come up with this idea that James Armistead is going to pretend to be an escaped slave. He's going to go into the British camp, pretending to be in favor of the British, but really spying on the British and coming back and reporting to Lafayette. So James, one day he goes in the British camp and he pretends like he's escaped. He goes, guys, please, I just got away from the Americans. Will you guys please take me in? I mean, the Americans were so mean and they beat me and they abused me. Would you nice British please take me in? And the British unknowingly said, well, yeah, you come stay with us. James starts serving in the British camp. He does such a good job serving in the British camp. The British officers saw him serving and said, we'd like a guy like that serving us. So the officers call him. He starts serving in the officer's tent. He becomes the personal assistant of Benedict Arnold, the famous American trader. So James Armistead is assisting Benedict Arnold, who, by the way, was working with Lord Cornwallis, the leader of the British. So James is getting all the British intelligence. And he's going back to Lafayette. He says, Lafayette, they're taking this many men, they're going to this place, they're marching on this road, they're going to show up at this time. So Lafayette is able to rally the Americans. The last major battle was the Battle of Yorktown, where we bottled up Cornwallis at Yorktown. Do you know the reason we were able to do that was because of James Armistead? Washington credits James Armistead with saving countless lives and being the reason we won the Battle of Yorktown. Now, what's amazing about this is as the Americans begin to win some of these battles, the British start looking around and they go, okay, the Americans are really a little better than we thought. We thought they're just a bunch of farmers with pitchforks. These guys are kind of impressive. We might need to up our game a little bit. So the British officers start talking strategy. And they said, one of the things we ought to do, we ought to find somebody that can go be a spy in the American camp so we can get some intel on the Americans. So they start looking around and they turn to James. And they said, James, we need to ask you a question. And James says, oh no, don't send me back to the Americans. They're so mean. I hate the Americans. Don't make me go. And they said, James, we'd consider it a personal favor. And James says, well, okay, for you guys, I'll do it. He's the first double spy in American history. He's in the British camp, spying for the Americans, pretending to be a spy for the British. This guy was incredible, and you've never heard his name before. Why? Could it be that the most racist president in the history of our nation, Woodrow Wilson, rewrote history books, which he did, that public schools used, which they did, and he removed every black hero from the history books? So today, nobody has any idea who these other heroes are. By the way, not only do you not know these black heroes, there's people like Bernardo de Galvez. Do you know when we were fighting the revolution, he was actually the governor of Cuba, and he came up from Cuba, and they actually fought in Florida and defeated the British in Florida. By the way, Martin de Mayorga, who was the governor of Guatemala at the time, he sent troops up from Guatemala to come join with Bernardo, who fought against the British in Florida. And by the way, Francisco Saavedra, who was the mayor of Mexico City at the time, sent more troops up to fight against the British. Why have we never heard of these Spanish leaders or heroes in the revolution? Well, some more guys we've never heard of. By the way, we don't even know about the females. Some of the incredible famous females. Sybil Ludington was considered the female Paul Revere. One night she made a 40-mile ride on horseback through a storm to go rally American troops because the British were marching into Connecticut, and it was because of her the Americans were able to stop the British. She used to be in every single history book. Today, most people have never heard of her. Or Elizabeth Lewis was a lady I mentioned last night who her defiance against the British stood up against them. They fired a cannonball. The cannonball went between her legs, blew out the boardwalk where she was standing. She would not back down. You're talking about incredible people we've never even heard of. And by the way, you also have people like Haim Solomon, who was a Jew. Do you know we had Jews that fought in the revolution against the British? It's amazing. He came from Poland a couple years before the revolution. When the revolution starts, he then starts working with Robert Morris, who was the financier. This guy is responsible for us getting the money we needed to pay the troops so we could fight the revolution. This is a famous statue of him shaking Washington's hand. Washington was thanking him for his work funding the revolution so we actually could have a revolution and oppose the British. And by the way, there were more Jews that fought in the revolution. Colonel David and Isaac Franks, Isaac Moses, Major Benjamin Nuns, Mordecai Sheftall, so many heroes, and today we haven't heard about any of them. This is the reality. We are told the bad, and we don't know the whole. We don't know about all these incredible heroes, and this is why you cannot just believe what someone tells you. You have to know the truth. You don't just listen to what someone says. You know what? Hey, let me go look this up. Let me go find out. Let me make sure. And this is why at Wall Builders, we always say you got to have original source documentation. We don't take somebody's word for it. You show me an original source where it confirms that thought. Because as we start to investigate original sources, what's amazing is it's not at all what we're being told. Well, this goes back to this notion. What Blackstone said is that God made all men free. All men are born free. That is the way God intends men to be. Well, you know, one of the things we also see in creation. Do you know of the 10 million species in nature, there's not one that murders its young while it's still in the womb? Humans are the only ones that do that. You can just look at nature and know abortion's wrong because God didn't create nature to work that way. You take something like the issue of homosexuality. Do you know there's not a species that is a homosexual species? They would cease to exist. I've grown up on a ranch and a farm my whole life. And let me just tell you, homosexuality ain't the way it works. If you aren't familiar with nature, you just get acquainted with nature, and you'll see real quick that ain't the way it works. Now, people argue. Now, of 10 million species, do you know there's about 3 or 4 species where there are homosexual acts? But 3 or 4 out of 10 million, that's not the rule, that's the exception. And by the way, even in those species, it's considered an aberration. But you can look at something like property. Do you know why animals are territorial? Because God put in them the defense of their property. See, you can just look at nature and you can see some of these lessons, but here's the problem. Whether it be because of the fallen, broken world we live in or our broken understanding, there's things in nature that we don't quite get the right lesson. Because if you take the issue of theft, does theft happen in nature? Yes. Will animals steal from other animals? Yes, they will. What about the issue of incest? Yes. That's not a problem for animals so much. Now, clearly not the way God intended it, but not so much a problem for animals. Or even take the issue of murder. Does murder happen in nature? It sure does. And this is why William Blackstone explained, we don't just have the laws of nature because that's not complete enough for our understanding. We also have the laws of nature's God. And the laws of nature's God, do you know the laws of nature's God show us real clear that, hey, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. The laws of nature's God explain what we don't see in the laws of nature clearly enough. And this is why those two things work together, the laws of nature, nature's God, which is what formed our common law, which, by the way, the Constitution says is what we operate under in America today. But this goes back to what we understood is that God established a fixed standard, a fixed moral law. And then here's the last thing I'm going to show you. That governments are instituted among men deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. We believed that people had a voice in America. That people ought to be able to have some ability and responsibility. In fact, you have people like George Washington, who was a member of the Federalist Party. This is the way he explained it. He said, the fundamental principle of our Constitution requires that the will of the majority shall prevail. So what the majority of the people want, that's what they get. Now, let me explain. This was the 5th principle. So this is after we understood there's a God who's given rights to men, government's job is to protect those rights, and God has given a fixed moral law. Below that, you have the consent of the governed. What that means is that the consent of the governed cannot contradict the first 4. So if the majority of Americans today decide that murder is now okay, murder is not now okay because it contradicts the first 4. Because God has given us a right to life. Government's job is to protect that. And God has a fixed moral standard. See, you cannot contradict those. But we understood we want to give the people freedom and give them choices. Well, Thomas Jefferson was a member of the anti-Federalist Party, so the opposite of what Washington was. But even Thomas Jefferson explained the will of the majority is the natural law of every society and is the only sure guardian of the rights of man. People's freedom and people's voice is what protects us going forward. We understood this is where we are safe, this is where we are secure. But notice the consent of the governed where it falls. We started off in the Declaration. We acknowledge that there is a God, that God has given us rights, that government's job is to protect the rights God has given us, that God has a fixed standard, a fixed moral law, and below that then we have the consent of the governed. But notice the principles that we built our nation on, there was a major acknowledgement that there is a God. And because there's a God, we've been given rights and we have liberties. We understood the function of government. But you know, if you don't understand there's a God, then you start to change the way you think. And here's a principle. A secular government cannot and will not ever be a limited government. Because if there is no God, government has to take the place of God. If God did not give you rights, government gives you rights. See, the reason we have a problem with some governmental things in America is because we've removed the knowledge of God. And so government has tried to become what God was and what God said and what God did. In fact, government's job was to protect what God had already instituted. But you think about the way we do it today. Take the issue of traditional marriage. God already created, established, and defined marriage. Well, government is now redefining it. Why? Because they don't acknowledge what God has done. Well, no, government, your job is to protect what God has already done. Your job is not to redefine what God has done. You take something like the issue of a right to life. Why does government think they have a voice in this? Your job is to protect what God has done, not redefine what God has done. You take the issue of the rights of conscience. Well, we think you should have to provide abortifacients. We think that you should have to do, well, we're government, and we decide, no. Government, your job is to protect what God has given me. And God gave me the rights of conscience. Your job is to protect it. You take the issue of religious expression. God was the one that said, in all your ways, acknowledge me. God is the one that said, my people need to come and they need to cry out. God is the one that calls government. Your job is to protect and make sure we always have a right to acknowledge and pray to our God. It's not to redefine it and say, well, we don't think you should do it at football games. We don't think you should do it in public school. We don't think you should do it but before a campaign or elections or political or government or city council. No, your job is to protect what God has given us. Take the issue of self-defense, self-protection, and government's coming in and they're regulating. No. Your job is to protect, and God has given me the ability to defend myself. If someone attacks me, I'm not the bad guy. Don't punish the good guy for protecting my family. God has given me the calling, the ability, the responsibility. Your job is to protect what God has given me. See, the problem is we have forgotten the role of government, and we have forgotten that there is a God who gave us rights. This is a very simple notion to understand. This is why John Adams explained that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Our nation was built on giving freedom to men. But freedom only works if you have a moral and a religious people. Because if you give freedom to immoral people, they do immoral things. And how do you have a moral people? It's only through religion. This is why Washington, in his farewell address, he explained of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. It cannot be done without religion and morality. We're trying to do it today and it's not working. Well, Washington explained all the way back then it wasn't going to work. Now, this is an argument we hear today. He says, let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Some people today argue, hey, we can teach our kids to be good people and we don't have to have God in school. We don't have to have religion. We'll just teach our kids to be good. Washington dealt with that argument all the way back then, and this is what he said. He said, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Now, when he says reason, we would know that as logic or common sense. And experience, that's the past. That's history. Common sense and history both tell us that if you remove God, it's not going to work. See, as a nation, we built on the principles that there was a God who gave us rights. We understood government's job. We understood that there was a fixed moral law. And then below that, we have freedom to operate according to what God has called us to do. But this is where we have confused it as a nation. We have to understand what made us successful are the principles that there was a God, and when you do it God's way, it works. Our nation struggles today because we've ceased to understand God's ways, and we've ceased to do it God's ways. We got to understand what God's ways are, and we got to get back to doing it God's way, because that is the only way that we can be successful in what we're doing, and that's what we as Christians have to do. Tag team.